Good afternoon. It's truly a pleasure and an honor for me to have the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon and to follow my esteemed colleague, Emil. This topic of ethics and ethical leadership, I looked at the schedule and I saw where yesterday you talked about effective leadership. And today we're talking about ethical leadership, which begs the question, is there a difference between the two? And I think there is, and most people agree. And we can use a simple example would be if you look at Hitler. I think one could argue that he was ineffective as a leader, to a certain point, but I think it would be hard for anybody to argue that he was ethical. I would like to make the case here that in the long run, effective leadership is ethical leadership. And part of that challenge is how you can put that in place in your individual countries. With that, I would like to talk about the things I want to talk about today. Are going to talk a little bit about the principles of ethical leadership. I'm not going to dwell on them too much, but I'm going to address them. Then I'm going to talk about what ethical leadership looks like and why it's important. And then I'm going to give some ideas on how to establish it. And finally, I'm going to give a couple examples of maybe some potential pitfalls. For the principles, and I look through different literature, there's different things that people will talk about what an ethical leader brings. But I'm going to highlight what I found to be, what I found were 5 of them. The first two, the first one is respect for others, and the second is service to others. And I think both those are linked. And it was related to the quote that Emil used earlier from General Powell, how he talked about, if your soldiers don't come to you, it's because you're not listening to them, and either you're not listening to them, which shows you don't respect them, and if they think you are listening but you won't do anything about it, that means you're not providing a service to others, and that's the essence of partly what we're trying to get at when they talk about this desire to respect and serve those who work for you. Similarly, another one is honesty. I think if we had to list characteristics of people associated with ethics, I think honesty would probably be the first one that most of them would put up there. But ethics is about more than being honest. It's also about creating an open dialogue. And I will put it in a leadership context. I would say ethical leadership, an honest leader tells the truth. An ethical leader takes the time to explain why, to talk to subordinates, to explain the reason why things are taking place. That's the dialogue that comes with being more than just honest, but being open. And the fourth principle is to be just. And as a leader, I think you've all worked with different leaders. You've worked with leaders that have been strict, some leaders that are less strict. But regardless of many strict leaders are respected as long as they're just. If they feel like punishments and rewards are giving out aren't based on a whim, if they're not based on ethnicity or religion or sex, if it's based on merit, that can be respected. That's part of ethical leadership. The fifth characteristic, and I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more in detail, is called building community. And they define a community as the reason why you build community is to influence a group of people to reach a common goal. And I emphasize that because I think those first 4 characteristics, respect for others, service to others, honesty, being just, I think those are the characteristics of ethical leadership that enable one to build that community of ethical leadership. So the 5th one to me is a function of how well one does the first 4. Now, okay, so I put those out there, got it. But what is it? What does ethical leadership? What's it look like? And what's it particularly look like for a military? Tomorrow, I know Dan Hampton is going to talk to you about George Washington, and you're going to and then you're going to go to Mount Vernon. I mean, that's an American example of ethical leadership. You have your own in Nelson Mandela, who Emil mentioned earlier. On a more specific case, or a more abstract case, I would say I heard someone once, we talk about a challenge to the African militaries or security sector, and they posed this question, and I like it. And the question was, do people in your country run to you or from you? And I pose that as an ethical construct, as a basic core question of what as a military. Now, and I'll give two examples. Now remember, this is non-attribution, both on the good and the bad. So the TPDF, when I worked in Tanzania, I tell you, the Tanzanian military was so well respected in their country. The TPDF wore their uniform all around town. They rode buses for free. They were respected as a builder within their community. And because the people respected them, I would argue, then they acted that way accordingly also. I actually remember a very good conversation I had with their chief of defense, who I have so much respect for, General Mwamunyange. And he talked to me once about the TPDF's challenges. They got called in to respond to a humanitarian mission. And they showed up. And he was worried about the image of the TPDF because they lacked the equipment to do the job. And he's like, our people expect so much of us. When we show up, we've got to be able to, we showed up, we were there, but all we had was shovels. And we needed more to try to do it. But my main point, in Tanzania, when the TPDF showed up in a village, the chief of defense worry wasn't that people weren't accepting them, was that they weren't going to be able to do enough. To me, I think that's the ethical leadership environment well established. We'll use Liberia on the flip side. Before 2003, now we have the new Armed Forces of Liberia, whose motto is a force for good. But in the lead up, when they were under their civil war, the big talk in Liberia was that if you saw the military, people ran. When you saw somebody in uniform, people ran from you. Their chief of defense right now, who is a good friend of mine, General Zancan, I like to tell this story because I think it's about service. He was working in the civilian sector in 2003, 2004, as they're trying to rebuild the new Liberian military. One of his friends, whose father had been the chief of staff in the old AFL, who had been killed, was trying to talk Zancan into joining the military. Zancan said, I don't want to be in the military. Why would I want to be in the military? And his friend, now Colonel Johnson, he said, hey, this is up to us. If we want to make the AFL different, people have to sacrifice and come join. General Zancan joined. He said he couldn't even tell his mom. He lied to his mom, which isn't ethical, but we understand why that might happen. Because his mom would have been embarrassed if he was joining the military. That's an example on the extreme end of a military that lacked that ethical component. Now, so we on the day-to-day ground, if you're talking about building this ethical leadership, some of the challenges, or what it might look like, more concrete. I'll give you some examples. Similar with Colonel Johnson, he's the brigade commander in Liberia, and he and I had long discussions about this. Much of our discussions weren't focused on tactics. He commanded 2,000 member unit, but he had about 5,000 family members and civilians that lived on his base. Most of our conversations revolved around his role as garrison commander. Because I think part of the ethical component of leadership, and it relates to some of the challenges we talked about low salaries and healthcare, is how can he provide better healthcare to his family members? How can he make the schools on his base be the best schools, the best public schools in Liberia, so that the sons and daughters of members of the AFL are getting an education to make them become better citizens when they got older. To me, I think that's a component of ethical leadership. Frankly, one of the things that I've enjoyed the most about my time in service in the U.S. military. I've served. I've enjoyed my time with soldiers, working with young Americans. I'm not going to go into the big political discussion that Dan Hampton would have liked me to go into. I would say that one of the discussions we do have in America is about this need of service. We have a small percentage of our society now serves. I am very proud that when a young man or woman shows up in a unit and they spend 3 or 4 years in the military, some stay in, some don't. But when they leave, I've hoped that their being in the military has made them a better citizen to go back out into their society. Now, why is that important? I would argue, and I'm going to digress a little bit away from ethical leadership, because if I'm going to say ethical leadership is important, I think there's got to be a reason why. One of the things that, when I start talking about this building community, one of the things that I think why it's particularly important in Africa, in my opinion, I could be wrong, and I'm surely not going to be the case in every country. But I think that there's a large challenge Africa faces is a lack of nationalism within individual countries. And I call it a challenge because it's not necessarily a bad thing, it's natural. We'll use America as an example. When we had our independence in 1776, in 1860, when we had the Civil War, that's 85 years after our independence. What most of you probably don't know is that during the Civil War, a West Point graduate, which is where I went to school, commanded on both sides, the North and the South, in every major battle of the Civil War. And the reason I'm bringing that up, because 85 years after our independence, when the issue of slavery came up and states decided to secede from the nation, West Point classmates, they didn't defend the Constitution that they swore to protect, as Emil talked about. They didn't side with the flag. They went to their states. If you were from Virginia, you shook the handmaid of your classmate who's from New York. You went the opposite way. You went to the South, the North, the New York went to the North, and you fought on the battlefield. And I think in many cases that happens across Africa today. For all the reasons you guys know better than me, in many of your countries there's a lack of a nationalism for so many different reasons. I think the military can help play a role in creating these citizens, creating this culture. It takes time. I just told you in America it took 85 years, before we still had a civil war to do it. But I believe that you can play a role in creating that community over time. Now, how do you create this ethical culture that I'm talking about? Three things I think are really important. First, you have to make it a priority. And I mean you got to make it a priority. It's got to be what you want to do. I had a good conversation over lunch with one of your colleagues, and we talked about all the different strategies and plans. And there's a lot of different plans out there. The challenge so often is in implementation. You've got to make it you've got to make it a priority, and then you've got to put effort and time and resources into that priority. And I'll give you another example, I think, which is a little bit illustrates the point. Well, actually, let me back up for a second. When I say make it a priority, I'll say by doing that, you got to set the example, and you also have to set conditions for success. And here's the example I wanted to provide. So I did pretty well in high school, but I didn't do great. Went to West Point, did well, but I didn't do great academically. And I remember talking, I asked my mom one day, I said, Mom, I was a little critical of her. I said, Mom, why didn't you push me a little harder when I was in high school to do a little better in school? And she said, she looked at me, she said, I didn't want you to cheat. She said, I thought there was a lot of pressure, and I was concerned that you would cheat. And I thought it was more important that you would be honest. She never had that conversation with me when I was growing up. But I've remembered that. I'll fast forward here to a situation with the Armed Forces of Liberia during Ebola. You got a young military. They're new. They've only been established since 2006. Ebola was a hectic situation. People are dying in the streets. You guys are familiar with what was going on. They got tasked to put checkpoints in. The president declared a curfew, and they were tasked to place checkpoints at the country starting at 9 o'clock at night. Okay, sounds good. Effective leadership. We know how to put a checkpoint in place, right? But what happened is about 2 days later, we had a hotel worker came by, called somebody from my office. We went, we took photos. The person had been whipped. They got markings on their back. They said it was the AFL. It may not have been. It was a uniformed person. It could have been the police or the AFL. And the story they said is I left the hotel at 9 o'clock. And I got stopped because the hotel manager is a major hotel in Liberia, wants to make money. All of a sudden, everybody's worried about losing money. He closed down at 9 o'clock, but his worker had to stay until about 9:15. So his worker's on the road at 9:20, gets stopped at a checkpoint. At the checkpoint, they say, what's going on? He said, hey, I left the hotel. It's 9:20. They didn't know what to do with him. They said, okay, I tell you what we're going to do. We're going to drive around the block. We're going to beat you while we're driving around the block. We get back, we'll let you go. Drive around the block, beat him, comes back. They say, don't do it again. Let him go. That story may or may not be 100% accurate, but we know similar stories. My point about putting the conditions in place is what as an ethical leader, what kind of position did we put this young soldier in out of the checkpoint? You guys know Africa better than me, but we can't send him to jail. The jails, we can't, there's no capacity to start rounding up everybody and send him to jail. The jails, Liberia didn't want him in jail. They have Ebola going on, even if they could take him. You can't fine them. It's not America where we're going to stop somebody, give them a ticket, catch a bill. They're not being fined. What I would tell you is that if ethical leadership is your priority, you know, there's a different way to, you got to foresee this situation. You tell your soldiers, hey, here's what, a soldier said, what are we going to do if we can't stop them? Well, here's what you're going to do. You're going to take their name. You're going to come back. Now, tell me how this story would have worked differently if this individual shows back up at his house, said, hey, I got stopped by the AFL, LMP, it doesn't matter. So I got stopped by them tonight. And you know what they did? They took my name down. They told me not to do it again. And then the AFL goes, and then somebody from the ministry shows up at the hotel the next night and says, hey, we stopped one of your employees. We need you to support this. What can we, this is ethical leadership. This is the point. I'm going to stop on that point, but you see where I'm going with this example. Those are the kind of things that if ethical leadership is your priority, you understand the importance of it, you take the time to put it in place, and you're willing to take some risk. You're willing to say, hey, I'm not going to round everybody up at a checkpoint, but I'm going to take names and see how many people we had, and I'm going to try to follow it up. Okay. Then I'm getting to going. So a couple more things. I said make it a priority. I said you also have to make ethical culture a part of personnel decisions. This is related to priority. You got to hire the right people. You got to fire the right people. You got to train the right. You got to provide training, and you have to be just. I said fire. I think there's a need to fire, but I think particularly when you're trying to establish culture, I think it's more important to be just and to be forgiving. If you have the, but you've got to be consistent. And you've got to make it a priority. If you show it's a priority and you're just and you forgive, if you take the time, if it's a priority, you can change culture. The last thing I'm going to say to wrap this up is because I definitely understand the challenges, and I'm going to emphasize this point again. I wish I would have written it down, but it was too quick. The quote Emile used for defining leadership or ethics. I'll go back to the earlier definition I used. The rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions or a particular group. Oftentimes the challenge you face is a conflicting ethics. You're trying to establish a military culture ethic over an existing, whether it's an ethnic or religious or different cultures. And in many cases right now, those existing cultures are stronger than the culture you're trying to put in place. Does ethics exist? You know, a quick example I'll give you from Chad, and then I'll stop, was that, you know, two of my very close friends, they were close friends of mine. One was a colonel, one was a general. The general actually, you know, got in an accident, accidentally killed a family member from the clan of my friend the colonel. And the colonel was obligated by the ethics of his clan then to culturally, to go and take a life from the tribe, from the family of the general. I had these guys over at my house all the time. We were close friends. From the definition of a military ethic, we'd see that as unacceptable. But from the cultural ethic, a quote that we use in our military peer, I often hear people say, to be judged by a group of your peers. When I look at that from a Western construct, I would judge that as unethical. From a military construct, that would be unethical. But from a group of the peers, of those from the cultural ethic, I think it would have been seen as ethical. That's one of your challenges. I'll stop there. I really look forward to your questions. Thank you for your time.